Sir, you need to move to seat 32B. We can't close the aircraft doors until you do. Henry Cole looked up, his voice low but steady. This is the seat I booked. I need an aisle seat because of a service-related injury. Flight attendant Kayla Bennett did not step back. We have a family with young children who need to sit together. If you don't cooperate, the flight will be delayed. Henry paused. Eyes began to turn toward him. An old man. A family. A flight being held up. I'm not refusing to help, Henry said slowly. But this seat isn't a preference. It's a medical necessity. Kayla lowered her voice, but it grew sharper. Then the only option left is a middle seat in the back row. The air inside the cabin froze. Henry looked down at his stiffened knee. Then he nodded. He unbuckled his seatbelt and rose with effort. My name is Henry Cole, former Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. I request that it be officially noted that I am being forced to give up my assigned seat for medical reasons. No one responded. Henry lifted his bag, turned away from the seat he had paid for, and began walking slowly toward the back of the plane. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in gunfire but in the silence of those who have lived through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories, so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and respect owed to our heroes. Henry Cole stopped at row 32 and gently angled his body into the middle seat 32B. The space felt tighter than he remembered. The seat back in front pressed close to his knees, the scent of disinfectant mixing with the familiar dampness near the lavatory. He turned very slowly, as if every movement first had to ask permission from his body. When his knee bent, a dull ache ran down his shin. Henry took a deep breath and steadied it. He didn't make a sound. The man on his left had claimed the armrest entirely. His elbow sat firmly in place as if it were a natural boundary. On Henry's right, a young man wearing headphones leaned noticeably into his space. Neither of them looked at him. Not a questioning glance. Not an awkward apology. Henry sat wedged between them, reduced within his own seat. He set his old canvas bag beneath his feet. The strap was frayed but neatly folded. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers lightly interlaced. The knuckles stood out, old calluses, never fully gone. Henry closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep, but to keep the pain from crossing its threshold. His knees stiffened, and each passing minute felt longer than the last. No one spoke. The low murmur of conversation up front was not meant for him. A short laugh sounded somewhere, then faded. Henry opened his eyes. The cabin ceiling felt lower than he'd expected. He tilted his head ever so slightly, searching for a position that might ease the pressure. There weren't many options. A middle seat was a place people endured, not a place they chose. After a while, Henry whispered so softly, it was meant only for himself. It's fine. Just 2 words. No one heard them. His breathing was steady but heavy. With every inhale, his chest rose slowly. With every exhale, his shoulders lowered just a fraction. He didn't complain. He was used to silence. Years ago, in far worse conditions, he had sat like this before, waiting, enduring, not bothering anyone. The man on the left shifted slightly, but didn't release the armrest. The young man on the right adjusted his headphones, sound leaking faintly into the air. Henry didn't react. He stared straight ahead. There was no irritation in his eyes, only a quiet weariness. A weariness that had been building for a long time, not just today. Time moved slowly. Henry felt every heartbeat. His knee began to go numb. He gently clenched his fingers, then let them relax, an old habit that helped him redirect his focus. No one noticed. No one realized the elderly man was fighting to keep his body from pushing back. No apology came. No one asked, "Are you okay?" Henry didn't expect it. He had lived long enough to know that concern is usually reserved for those who speak up. Those who remain silent are often overlooked. He lowered his gaze slightly, looking at his worn shoes. They were clean, carefully tied. Henry always tied his laces neatly, even when no one was watching. He believed in small things like that. Discipline doesn't disappear just because a man leaves the service. It simply exists quietly, like the man he was now. An announcement sounded from the front, but Henry didn't catch it. He didn't need to. He only needed to sit still, keep his knee from locking, keep his back straight, keep his dignity from shifting even slightly. Inside the cabin, everything went on as usual. Passengers fastened their seatbelts. A few adjusted their carry-ons. Life continued without needing Henry Cole. And in that moment, the silence around him grew heavier, not the silence of peace, but the silence of being forgotten. Henry sat there between 2 strangers near the lavatory, with a throbbing knee and labored breath. He hadn't vanished. But he was no longer being seen. The silence had done that for him, without a single word spoken. And when a person becomes invisible in a crowd, that is precisely when humiliation begins, without the need for a single insult. It's just a seat change. The voice was barely loud enough for the person beside them to hear. There's no need to make such a big deal out of it. A soft exhale followed half a laugh, half a scoff, then silence. Henry Cole heard it. He heard it clearly. His hearing was still sharp, even if his body no longer moved the way it once had. He didn't turn around. He didn't react. The words passed over him like a draft slipping through a door left ajar, not loud but cold. He shifted his left foot slightly. Just a fraction. Pain flared like a quick cut. Henry tightened his jaw and held his posture. His back stayed straight. His shoulders did not slump. He had learned this long ago. When the body hurts, posture matters even more. Pain belongs inside. Dignity is what others see. He's acting like the whole flight revolves around him. Another voice whispered lower but close enough. Henry inhaled slowly. The breath scraped through his dry throat. He placed his hands back on his thighs, fingers pressed neatly together. His knuckles were stiff, but they did not tremble. He stared straight ahead, not because he refused to look at them, but because he didn't need to. He already knew he was being judged. The pain spread from his knee, dull at first, then sharp. For a fleeting moment, memory surfaced, not images, just sensation. The ground shuddering, a distant blast, heat slamming into his left leg. A fall, then silence. Henry blinked. He was here in an aircraft cabin between two strangers not there, but his body remembered perfectly. He was probably strong back then. Now he's just old. The comments weren't aimed directly at him, but they didn't need to be. They existed in the shared air enough for him to know he was the subject. Humiliation doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs quiet agreement. Henry shifted his foot again, more slowly this time. He searched for a position that might ease the pressure. It didn't work. He stopped. He accepted it. Some things can't be fixed immediately. Some battles aren't worth starting, especially when others don't even see them as battles. A passenger seated ahead turned around and looked at him. The gaze lingered for a second, then moved on. No malice. No kindness either. Just the look of someone who had decided this wasn't their concern. Henry was more familiar with that than anyone. He heard seatbelts clicking, the soft clatter of luggage. Life continued smooth, orderly. His discomfort didn't interrupt a single rhythm. And in that moment, he understood something very old. When a person makes no noise, their suffering is easily treated as if it doesn't exist. Henry swallowed. His throat felt drier than before. He didn't say, "I'm in pain." He didn't say, "This is who I used to be." He didn't need to prove anything to these people. The ones whispering wouldn't understand even if he did speak. Understanding doesn't come from explanations. It comes from choosing to truly see another human being. It's only a few hours in a different seat. Another comment light as air. Henry closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to keep the memories from spilling over. He had spent a lifetime learning how to control things like that. He opened his eyes again. His gaze was steady. No anger. No resentment. Only a quiet, heavy acceptance. This humiliation had no clear shape. It didn't stand in front of him. It didn't call him by name. It seeped in through fragmented remarks, passing glances, and indifference dressed up as normal. It happened publicly among dozens of people, yet it was subtle enough that no one had to take responsibility. Henry Cole sat there in the middle seat, with a throbbing knee and memories that had never left him. He wasn't pushed. He wasn't shouted at. But he was being diminished inch by inch in the minds of those around him. And then, among all the eyes that had turned away, there was one that remained. The woman seated in front did not turn away. She looked at Henry long enough to understand that silence in this moment was also a choice. Ella Parker sat upright in the row ahead. She no longer turned around, yet every sound behind her still reached her clearly. The whispers had faded not because compassion had appeared, but because the matter was considered finished. An old man had changed seats. Order had been restored. For most people, that was where the story ended. But for Ella, it had only just begun. She looked down at her hands. One rested on her thigh, the other lightly touching her phone. Ella had lived long enough to recognize the difference between not wanting trouble and not being able to stay silent. This moment clearly belonged to the latter. She wasn't angry. She wasn't dramatic. There was only a very specific weight pressing in her chest. If she did nothing, then no one would. Ella woke the screen. A pale glow appeared. She typed slowly short lines, precise without excess. Henry Cole, forced to move from seat 14C to 32B. Medical reason service-related injury occurred on this flight. She paused for a second and read it again. No added emotion, no judgment. Just the facts placed in the right order. Ella pressed send. The message left her hand and went to the flight operations department through an internal channel she had once used in her previous work. She didn't need to write more. The people who needed to understand would understand quickly. Ella set the phone down. She sat still. She didn't look out the window. She didn't look back. She didn't need to see Henry to know he was still there. The image of him sitting upright in the middle seat, knee-stiff eyes, not pleading, was already etched into her memory. A flight attendant passed by. Ella looked up and caught her eye for half a second. No one spoke. The attendant kept walking. Ella wasn't disappointed. She wasn't expecting an immediate reaction. She only needed to make sure the story didn't die inside the cabin. The cabin door closed. The sound was low and final. A few passengers adjusted their posture. Seatbelts were pulled tight. Everything followed procedure. Henry Cole was still seated in row 32. No one came to ask if he was okay. No one revisited the decision that had just been made. But Ella knew that somewhere else the information she had sent would not be so easily dismissed. She closed her eyes briefly, not to pray, just to breathe. Ella didn't think she had done anything extraordinary. She didn't consider it an act of heroism. To her, it was simply about keeping a boundary from being erased, the boundary between convenience and fairness, between silence and complicity. A passenger beside her leaned over and whispered, "What's going on?" Ella shook her head slightly. "It's not my story to tell." She faced forward again. Her eyes were calm. No worry. No anticipation. She had done her part. The rest was no longer in her hands. Behind her, Henry still sat quietly. Ella didn't look back, but she knew. There are some people you don't need to see to know exactly where they are. He had endured long enough, and this time that endurance was not falling entirely into empty space. A light vibration in Ella's jacket pocket? Her phone. She didn't reach for it right away. She waited a few seconds, then opened it. A brief response appeared. No explanation. No elaboration. Just enough to confirm that the message had been received and was being forwarded. Ella locked the screen. She exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in understanding that the wheels had begun to turn, however quietly. Wheels like those rarely make noise, but when they turn at the right moment, they can change an entire direction. The plane had not yet begun to taxi. Inside the cabin, the silence had taken on a different quality. No one noticed except the one person who had chosen not to look away. Ella Parker sat there as ordinary as any other passenger, yet her decision had already left this cabin and was on its way to where it needed to be. And at that very moment, up front, a notification appeared in a place not everyone could see, signaling that this story was far from over. Captain James Reynolds finished reading the report in silence. There were no extra words, no emotional commentary, only bare facts, the passenger's name, the original seat, the reassigned seat, the medical reason, the time it occurred. He read slowly, very slowly, as if each line had to be placed exactly where it belonged before a decision could be made. He looked up. Hold position. The first officer turned toward him, slightly taken aback. "Captain, we haven't begun taxiing. I'll be back shortly." James Reynolds stood. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve out of old habit, clean, precise, decisive. More than 2 decades in uniform had left him with a reflex that required no thought. When there is injustice, you don't ask, "Is it worth it?" You ask who is responsible. He stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin still carried small, ordinary sounds, passengers adjusting their seats, a soft cough, a sentence left unfinished. But when James Reynolds appeared, those sounds seemed to shrink on their own. No one said a word. Attention shifted with each step he took. A nearby flight attendant noticed first. She hesitated slightly. "Captain?" James gave a faint nod without slowing. "Who handled the seat change for passenger Henry Cole?" The question wasn't raised in volume, but it was clear enough for those nearby to hear. The attendant pointed toward the back of the cabin. "Captain, that passenger is seated in row 32. James Reynolds said nothing more and continued forward. His steps were straight and even, neither hurried nor slow. Eyes began to follow him. Some passengers tilted their heads. Others lowered their voices. Some fell completely silent. The quiet spread not from fear, but from a shared instinct that something was changing. Henry Cole didn't look up right away. He only sensed the shift in the air around him. The whispers had stopped. The pressure in the cabin was no longer scattered. It had gathered focused on something approaching. When Henry finally lifted his gaze, he saw Captain James Reynolds standing a few rows away. James paused for a brief moment and observed. He saw the cramped middle seat. He saw Henry's knee pressed tight. He saw the way the old man kept his back straight despite the discomfort. These details needed no explanation. They spoke for themselves. James spoke. "Sir, I'm James Reynolds, the captain of this flight." Henry blinked once and gave a small nod. "Yes, Captain." James didn't ask anything further. He didn't ask why Henry was there. He didn't ask who made the decision. He already knew enough. And because of that, his next words were unmistakably clear. This flight will remain paused until the situation is addressed. A few passengers inhaled. No one objected. No one spoke. James Reynolds turned to the flight attendant nearby. "Please notify ground operations. We're addressing a serious issue." The attendant nodded and moved off quickly. James turned back toward Henry. He leaned in just slightly enough that his voice was meant only for the two of them. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry for what happened. Please give me a moment." Henry didn't speak. He simply nodded. A small gesture, but a steady one. James straightened. He faced the cabin, his voice carrying not loud but impossible to ignore. "We will not continue this flight until every passenger is treated with proper respect." There was no applause, no words of praise, only a different kind of silence, deeper, heavier, a silence of recognition. Passengers began to understand that the seat change was not a minor detail. It was a boundary that had been crossed. James Reynolds turned back, took a few more steps, and stopped directly in front of row 32. He stood there upright, his eyes fixed on Henry Cole. Not the gaze of a superior toward a subordinate, but the look of someone who deeply understood the weight of silent endurance. And when Captain James Reynolds stopped before that row, the truth began to step out of the shadows, ready to be named. Captain James Reynolds stood upright in front of row 32. He didn't speak right away. He took a short breath, then came to attention, and rendered a formal salute to Henry Cole. The gesture was crisp and by the book, needing no explanation. For a brief second, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Henry blinked. He wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention. He returned the salute with a slight nod, small but unmistakable. James Reynolds spoke, his voice calm and carrying clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Henry Cole, I owe you an apology." He paused for a beat. "Forcing you to give up the seat you booked especially for medical reasons was wrong. Completely wrong." No one interrupted. No one whispered. The silence was no longer indifference. It was attention. James continued. "As the captain of this flight, I take responsibility for that mistake, and I am going to correct it right now." He turned slightly, looking down the length of the cabin. "We will move Mr. Henry Cole to seat 1A. A few passengers startled. "If no one is willing to give up their seat, I will give up mine." Henry parted his lips slightly as if to speak. James raised a hand, gently stopping him. "Please allow us to do what is right." A moment of silence passed. Then a younger man, seated off to the right side of the cabin, stood abruptly. He swallowed hard, his voice shaking, but clear. "Captain." He turned toward Henry. "Sir, I served under your command." Henry looked at him, searching his face. "Helmand Base, 2009. The man said quickly, as if afraid he might lose his nerve. "You pulled me out of an armored vehicle after it hit a mine. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here." The rhythm of the cabin changed. Some passengers lifted their heads. Others looked down. No one whispered anymore. James Reynolds turned to the young man. "Thank you." Then he looked back at Henry, his voice lower now. "Mr. Cole, you are not just a passenger. You are a veteran who saved the life of a fellow serviceman." Henry tightened his hands slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't bow his head. He spoke only one sentence, very softly. "I was just doing my duty." James nodded. "And that is exactly why we owe you an apology." He turned to the nearby flight attendant. "Please prepare seat 1A immediately." The attendant nodded, her face paling as the weight of the mistake fully sank in. A passenger in the front cabin stood up before being asked. "I'll change seats." No one objected. No one argued. It happened naturally, as if the entire cabin had reached a quiet agreement on something fundamental. Some people should never be pushed to the back of the plane. James Reynolds inclined his body toward Henry and offered his hand. "If you'll allow me." Henry rose slowly but steadily. Pain shot through his knee, but he didn't falter. The young man whose life he had saved stepped aside and stood straight. "Sir." His voice caught. Henry nodded to him, his expression softening. There were no promises, no long recollections, just recognition between two men who had shared something that didn't need to be spoken. As Henry began walking forward, the eyes throughout the cabin changed row by row. Glances that once passed over him now lingered longer. Not with curiosity, not with judgment. Only respect that arrived late but arrived where it belonged. James Reynolds walked a few steps behind him, keeping just enough distance. He didn't need to say anything more. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be corrected had already begun. And from that moment on, the cabin no longer saw Henry Cole as a man who had been forced to change seats, but as a man who carried a kind of honor that required everyone else to quietly adjust themselves in its presence. Kayla stopped short in the aisle. Her hands tightened around the small tablet held against her chest. The professional composure she usually carried was gone. She bowed her head very low, her voice quieter than usual. "Sir, I'm sorry." The words came out unevenly, as if she herself wasn't yet accustomed to admitting her mistake in front of so many people. Henry Cole looked at her. His eyes held no sharpness, no coldness, only the gaze of someone who had lived through too many years to keep holding on to anger. He didn't answer right away. A beat passed. Then he said simply, clearly enough for her to hear, "Let it go." 2 words. No reproach, no condemnation, no demand for compensation. Kayla looked up, stunned. She blinked repeatedly, as if unsure she had heard correctly. Henry gave a small nod as though closing the matter right there. He didn't need a longer apology. He didn't need a formal gesture of amends. For him, what mattered had already happened. Captain James Reynolds turned toward the front of the cabin. He picked up the microphone but didn't speak immediately. He waited until the cabin was completely quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear, neither raised nor overly subdued. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have a moment of your attention?" Heads lifted. No one spoke. "Today we witnessed a mistake." He paused. "A person was treated unfairly. And if we choose silence, that mistake will continue to exist." Henry remained still. He didn't look around. He listened as if guided by an old habit formed during years spent standing in formation. "I want to be very clear," Captain Reynolds continued. "We do not take off while injustice remains in this cabin. Not at 30,000 feet and not anywhere else." A few passengers nodded faintly. Some clenched their hands. There was no cheering, no loud applause. Agreement spread quietly through silence. James went on. His voice softening, "There are people who don't need to speak loudly to deserve respect. And there are sacrifices that don't need to be repeated every day. But that does not mean we are allowed to forget them." He paused, then delivered his final line. "Thank you for your patience. We will continue our flight." The microphone was set down. No one applauded immediately. A moment passed. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Then a third. Not loud. Not hurried. The applause came slowly, evenly, as if everyone understood this was not a moment for personal emotion, but for shared respect. Henry did not join in. He didn't raise his hands. He simply sat there, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. But his eyes softened, not because of the applause, but because he knew he had just witnessed something rare, justice being named without argument. Kayla stood off to the side. She didn't wipe away tears. She didn't turn away. She stood straight, as if committing to memory a lesson no classroom could teach. Passengers who had whispered earlier now lowered their heads. No one tried to justify what they had said before. The silence was no longer indifference. It was acknowledgement. Henry tilted his head slightly toward the window. Outside, everything looked the same. But inside this cabin, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to make people reconsider how they treat a quiet human being. He remembered earlier days, times when his comrades said nothing, times when orders were given and carried out without question. But he also remembered the rare moments when someone stood up and said, We don't do that. Those moments were few, but they stayed. When the plane began to move, no one spoke about the seat change anymore. No one revisited the mistake that had just occurred. But the lesson remained quietly, like a mark that doesn't fade easily. Henry closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep, but to breathe. One deep breath lighter than before. He opened his eyes and looked forward. The flight continued, but the journey everyone had just taken didn't appear on any map. And when the wheels lifted off the ground, what was carried upward was not just passengers, but a reminder that honor only truly exists when people know how to stop in the face of injustice. Henry Cole stood in the middle of the ceremonial grounds, moving slowly but with steadiness. In front of him, rows of Naval Academy midshipmen stood in perfect alignment, white caps bright beneath the clear sky. His granddaughter was there. Her posture was rigid, her gaze fixed straight ahead. When her name was called, she stepped forward to receive her diploma, shoulders steady, steps unwavering. Henry watched his chest tightening for a brief moment, not from public pride, but because a circle had quietly closed. After the ceremony, she ran toward him. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around Henry. He caught her, his hands firm yet gentle. "Are you tired, Grandpa?" Henry shook his head and smiled. "I'm fine. I'm still standing." A week later, back in the small house he knew so well, Henry received a letter. The envelope was thick, the print clean and formal. He opened it and read slowly. It was an official apology from the airline. No evasions, no excuses, just acknowledgement. Included was a decision granting him lifetime guest of honor status. No conditions, no complicated procedures. Henry folded the letter and placed it on the table beside the neatly folded flag. He said nothing. But his hand rested a moment longer than usual on the edge of the table, as if confirming that it was real. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one came from the military archives. His service record, once lost, had been reviewed and restored. The dry official lines documented how he had pulled fellow servicemen out of danger while his knee was already injured. Henry stopped reading there. He set the paper down and sat quietly. There were no tears, only a deeper stillness. Not because he had been recognized, but because what had once been forgotten had finally been named. Henry's life didn't change much. He still drank black coffee every morning, still sat on the porch in the late afternoon, still walked slowly around the neighborhood. But something was different. When he walked now, his back was straighter. Not because others were watching, but because he no longer felt the need to avoid anyone's gaze. People began to notice him in ordinary ways. A nod, a greeting. No one asked what he had done in the war. No one asked him to tell his story again. Respect didn't need explanation. It only needed to show up at the right time. One quiet afternoon, Henry sat on the front steps watching the sun sink low. His knee still hurt. That hadn't changed. But the pain no longer defined him. It was simply part of a longer story, one that was no longer interrupted by silence. His granddaughter called. "Grandpa, I've been assigned to my first ship this summer." Henry listened and nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Do your job well, that's enough." He ended the call and sat there a while longer. There was no applause, no ceremony, just an old man who had lived long enough to understand that honor doesn't come from having your name repeated over and over. It comes from the moment when someone is willing to stand up and say, "This is wrong." Henry's story didn't change the world. It didn't rewrite history. But it changed one airplane cabin. It changed how a few people looked at themselves. And sometimes that is enough. Because memory, if not preserved, disappears. And respect, if not practiced, becomes an empty word. Henry stood up and went inside. The door closed gently behind him. Life went on quietly without display. But from that day forward, every step he took carried something no one could take from him anymore. Recognition that came late, but came where it mattered. Service honor stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.